Alright, this is lesson 2.2. In the last lesson, we looked at how to solve equations graphically. And in this lesson, we're going to review the methods that you can use to solve equations algebraically. And most of these methods you should have learned in Algebra 1, maybe Algebra 2, but here they are. You've learned how to solve equations using factoring, how to use square roots to solve equations, completing the square, that might be one that you maybe haven't seen before, and then the quadratic formula. So we're going to take a look at each of these methods. Now, in this lesson, or this video, I'm going to suggest that you watch how to do each method and then pause the video and complete the problems after you've watched that section, and then go on and watch the next section of the video. But you can choose to just watch the whole video if you like, and then do the whole assignment. It's up to you. That's just my suggestion. Alright, the first method that you learned how to solve equations is called factoring. And when you factor an equation, you want to get that equation equal to 0 first, and what you're trying to do is come up with a solution that includes two factors. And then you solve that equation to get the solutions. So hopefully that's ringing some bells, but here's how it works. First thing I'm going to do to this equation is get rid of this 10 by subtracting it from both sides, and that gives me 3x squared minus x minus 10 equals 0. Now this is a trinomial to the second degree with the x squared. What you want to do is factor that into two binomials. Now there are a whole bunch of ways to do this. The method I use is called the table method. If you've never seen this before, don't let it freak you out, but here's how it works. You take the first term and you write it in here, 3x squared. You take the middle term and you write it at the bottom, and you take the last term and you put it here. What you want to do is come up with numbers that multiply to give you 3x squared. Well, there's really only one combination, 3x times x. That's 3x squared. Then you want to come up with numbers that give you negative 10. And those numbers in these spots also have to cross multiply to give you negative x. So really the only way you're going to get that answer is to just throw numbers in and guess. So I'm going to go 5 and negative 2. So 5 times negative 2 is negative 10. When I multiply like this, 5 times x equals 5x. And 3x times negative 2 is negative 6x. And when I add those two numbers together, that gives me negative x. So my guess was lucky. So my answer is going to be this column and this column. So I get 3x plus 5 and x minus 2. Now, this may not be a method that you're familiar with. All that you really need to know is how to factor this equation into two binomials. And if you've done it in a different way, that's okay, use your method. But you're not finished. Now you have to take these two binomials and solve each one to find the solution to this algebraic equation. While the one on the right is the easiest, I'm going to add 2 to both sides. One of my solutions is 2. The other equation, I subtract 5 from both sides, I get 3x equals negative 5. Then I divide by 3 and get x equals negative 5/3. And those are the two solutions to my equation solved by using factoring. So, to practice this, here are 6 examples. Now, this is where you could stop the video and do these equations on a piece of paper. But I'm going to help you get started. I'm going to do number 1 with you. It says x squared minus 8x plus 15 equals 0. First step is to factor this into two binomials. Two numbers that multiply to give me 15 and add to give me a negative number. Both of them have to be negative. And I'm just going to take a guess and say negative 5 times negative 3 equals positive 15, and negative 5 plus negative 3 is negative 8. So this trinomial factors into these two binomials. And then I set each of those equal to 0. Oops. And solve. Add 5 to both sides, I get x equals 5. Add 3 to both sides, I get x equals 3. Again, this is an Algebra 1 skill, so I'm hoping that what I'm showing you is review and that you remember how to factor. So give the rest of those a shot, and when you're finished, come back and start the video again. Okay, the second method is to use square roots. Now this one's a little easier than the first method. Using square roots to solve this equation, what you do is you first get the x squared term isolated. So to get this equation to look like this, I'm first going to divide both sides by 3. That gives me x squared equals 9 divided by 3 is 3. And once you get the x squared isolated, to figure out what x is, you take the square root of x squared, and that equals x. And what you do to one side, you do to the other side. Now recall that when you take the square root of both sides of an equation like this, when you're finding what x squared could be equal to, this answer has a possibility of being positive square root of 3 or negative square root of 3. So you end up with two solutions. Now, sometimes using the square roots involves a more complicated problem like this one. So to solve a problem like this, instead of getting the x squared term by itself, you're going to get the expression that's squared by itself. So in this problem, my first step is to divide by 2 on both sides. I'm doing that to get rid of this 2. That leaves me with x plus 4 squared. On the other side, 6 divided by 2 is 3. Now you have this expression that's being squared all by itself. You're going to take the square root of both sides, like that. Taking the square root of x plus 4 squared leaves you with just x plus 4. The opposite of squaring a number is taking the square root. Those cancel each other out. And that's equal to plus or minus square root of 3. And now what's left in the parentheses really doesn't need parentheses anymore. And you can solve for x by subtracting 4 from both sides. You get x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 3. And that's it. Those are your two solutions. Now technically you could write out the two solutions and figure out what negative 4 plus the square root of 3 is as a decimal number, and what negative 4 minus the square root of 3 is, but this answer is just as acceptable. So here's the next set of problems. Again, you should stop the video and complete these problems while it's still fresh in your mind, and then come back and restart the video when you're done. Alright, the third method for finding the solution to an algebraic equation is called completing the square. Now, completing the square just means you're going to make this equation look like a perfect square equation. And I don't know if you remember what those look like, but a perfect square equation is one that's in this form. So if I tried to factor x squared minus 6x plus 1, I couldn't do it. There's not a number that multiplies to give me 1, and I end up with a negative 6 in the middle. So what I'm going to do is set this up to make it a perfect square. Here's what I do. First, I get rid of the constant term by moving it to the other side. So I subtract 1 from both sides. Now I'm looking for a number here that will make this side of the equation a perfect square. And to do that, what I do is I take half of the middle term, 6 divided by 2 is 3, and then I square it. 3 squared is 9. So I'm going to add 9 to this side of the equation to make this side a perfect square. And if I add 9 to one side of an equation, I have to add 9 to the other side of the equation. Now, by adding that 9, what I've done is I've created an equation that's now a perfect square. And that perfect square is x minus 3, because x minus 3 times x minus 3, if you remember FOIL, gives me x squared minus 3x plus 9, or x squared minus 6x plus 9. So this factors into this. Alright, and on the right hand side, negative 1 plus 9 is 8. And I'm going to solve this just like I did using roots in the previous example. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. I get x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 8. And now if I add 3 to both sides, I get x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 8. Those are my two solutions, and I found that by completing the square. Okay. This might be a little complicated, so I'm going to do the first one with you, and then you should stop the video and finish the other three. I have x squared minus 2x equals 12. Now, this one already has the constant term on the right-hand side, so all you're going to have to do is figure out what you have to add here to make this a perfect square. Remember, to find that last term, you take the middle term, negative 2, you divide it in half, which is negative 1, and then you square negative 1, which is positive 1. So you add plus 1 here on this side, you do the same thing to the other side. This trinomial, x squared minus 2x plus 1, is a perfect square. It is x minus 1 squared. And on the other side, 12 plus 1 is 13. And then you finish it off. Take the square root of both sides. You get x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 13. Add 1 to both sides, and your answer is 1 plus or minus the square root of 13. Okay, pause the video, do these three problems. Okay, the last method is the quadratic formula. I'm hoping you've seen the quadratic formula before. It is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, this part's also known as the discriminant, over 2a. And really it's just a formula. All you have to do is replace a, b, and c in this formula with a, b, and c from the equation. And a, b, and c come from a quadratic equation. So first thing you have to do is get this equal to 0. So x squared plus 3 equals negative 8x. To make this equal to 0, I add 8x to both sides. And I get x squared plus 8x plus 3 equals 0. A quadratic equation is in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So the letter a is always the number next to the x squared term, the letter b is always the number next to the x, and the c is always the constant. So for me, it's always helpful to write out what's a, what's b, and what's c and then put those into the quadratic formula. So in this equation, there's no number next to the x squared, so it's implied to be a 1. The number next to the x is an 8, and the constant is a 3. So I just put a, b, and c into a, b, and c in this formula like this. X is equal to negative b. b is 8, so negative 8 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 3, all over 2 times a. Now you can write out all the steps that you want to write out, but here's the easiest way I know how. First, just try to do as much as you can inside of the square root. 4 times 1 times 3, 4 times 1 is 4 times 3 is 12. 8 squared is 64. 64 minus 12 is 52. So I'm going to rewrite it out. Negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 52 over 2 times 1 is 2. Okay, here's where having a calculator is going to help you. These are two solutions. One solution is negative 8 plus the square root of 52 over 2, and one is negative 8 minus the square root of 52 over 2. You're going to have to work out both solutions. If you have a scientific calculator or a graphing calculator, either one works just fine. Negative 8 plus the square root symbol is right here above the x squared, square root of 52. I'm just going to hit enter and get an answer, and then divide that by 2. I get negative 0.394. That's one answer. The other answer, I'm going to find that by doing the same thing. Negative 8, only instead of adding the square root of 52, I'm going to subtract the square root of 52. I'm going to hit enter and get an answer, and then I'm going to divide that by 2. I get negative 7.60555, so I'm going to round up to 6. That's the other answer. So, using the quadratic formula just involves you making the equation, set it equal to 0, making it look like this, figuring out what the a, b, and c are, and then putting those into the formula, and then finally figuring out what the exact answer is. Okay, 6 more problems using the quadratic formula, and then you're done.